All right. Well, welcome everyone. On behalf of the Reiff Center for Human Rights and Conflict Resolution at Christopher Newport University, I'd like to thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Dr. Youssef Chouhoud, and I am an assistant professor of political science here at CNU. Tonight, I have the privilege of speaking with a powerhouse panel on Turkey's authoritarian turn and the prospects for human rights in the Middle East. We have with us tonight Dr. Lisel Hintz, an assistant professor of international relations at Johns Hopkins University's School of Advanced International Studies. Her first book, Identity Politics Inside Out, National Identity Contestation and Foreign Policy in Turkey, published by Oxford University Press in 2018, investigates how contestation over various forms of identity, ethnic, religious, regional, spills over from domestic politics to shape and be shaped by foreign policy. Dr. Hintz contributes to foreign policy, the Washington Post, the Boston Globe, and BBC World Service, as well as to academic and public policy discussions on Turkey's increasing authoritarianism, opposition dynamics, foreign policy shifts, and identity-related topics, including the Kurdish issue. We also have with us tonight Dr. Shadi Hamid, a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution and contributing writer at The Atlantic. And co-host of the Wisdom of Crowds podcast, which you should all subscribe to if for some weird reason you're not subscribed to already. He is the author most recently of Islamic Exceptionalism, How the Struggle Over Islam is Reshaping the World, which was shortlisted for the 2017 Lionel Gelber Prize for Best Book on Foreign Affairs, and is co-editor of Rethinking Political Islam. His first book, Temptations of Power, Islamists and Illiberal Democracy in a New Middle East, was named Foreign Affairs Best Book of 2014. I'll be serving as moderator for what I am sure will be an engaging and enlightening discussion, inshallah, as Joe Biden would say, but not as he would use it, like the actual inshallah, not the colloquial. So let me just say a little bit about what's motivating today's discussion before we kind of jump into it. So this motivation really can be traced back to 2002 when the Justice and Development Party in Turkey, the AKP, had a resounding victory in the Turkish general election. And the man at the helm of the party was, of course, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, or as Egyptians say, Recep Tayyip Erdogan. Now, the AKP came from an Islamist background, but really recast itself in the style of European Christian Democrats. And in their initial years in power, the AKP under Erdogan would initiate a number of liberalizing reforms, and there was a genuine sense among many circles that they were doing something quite significant and perhaps quite long-lasting. They were perhaps providing a model for how to govern a modern Muslim majority state. And this didn't go unnoticed outside of the region either. Turkey began to climb on various notable democracy indexes, though never quite attaining the coveted designation of free under Freedom House's famous tripartite scheme. Still, as the Arab uprisings swept the region, there was a sense that Turkey could perhaps provide a template for these potential transitions out of authoritarian rule. Fast forward to today, however, and Turkey's democratic stock has seen better days. It's at its lowest perhaps in quite a while. It is distinctly, according to Freedom House, not free, with a particularly precipitous drop in its rankings on both pluralism and freedom of speech. Now, this has been a trend for a number of years, but really took a precipitous turn around a failed coup attempt a number of years back. And since 2016, since that failed coup attempt, there has been a wide-ranging crackdown on dissent in various forms within the Turkish state. In fact, for those of you who are interested, you can go to turkeypurge.com, and you know things are bad when you get a domain like that, and see the most up-to-date statistics on arrests made, approaching 100,000 as of today, journalists arrested, well over 300, judges, prosecutors dismissed, well over 4,000, and for our kind of clique, academics who have lost their jobs, well over 6,000. And so that's what animates tonight's discussion, to better understand both what is happening in Turkey today, what led to the current situation, as well as how it ties in and can inform our understanding of broader themes. So I'd like to start with Dr. Hintz, and first of all, given that you've had such extensive on the ground experience in Turkey, I wonder if you can just begin by telling us a little bit whether that stylized depiction that I gave of Turkey, if there's anything kind of off with that, or if there's anything that you can expand on. I mean, how was Erdogan and the AKP first viewed when they came into power? Was it with this sense of genuine hope? And are things truly as bad as many are depicting today? I mean, would you feel comfortable, for example, calling Turkey today an authoritarian state?
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. I think this is a great forum, and we're investigating really important questions. So I'm really glad that you're providing this opportunity. I 100% feel comfortable calling Turkey an authoritarian state. Within political science, as you know, we've got lots of different characterizations of regime types. And some of the scholars doing the best work on Turkey from that perspective call it a competitive authoritarian regime, in which elections still take place. But you have a party that manipulates the playing field. Those elections are not free and fair, and that they tend to dominate throughout those elections. I'm sort of the mind that we could maybe situate Turkey between competitive authoritarianism and personalistic authoritarianism. And the reason that I say that is because of the role of Recep Tayyip Erdogan, the way that he has consolidated power in his own hands, both within an institutional space, by taking Turkey from a parliamentary democracy in which the parliament could serve as a form of checks and balances to a consolidated executive presidency, but also just the way that his sort of charismatic personality and persona and personal story, have captivated, so many people, and the way in which he has positioned himself by purging so many potential challengers to his rule. He really calls all the shots. So I have no problem saying that Turkey's somewhere between a competitive authoritarian and personalistic authoritarian regime. In terms of where we've come from with Justice and Development Party rule, AKP rule, when they come into power in 2002, it's really going to depend on who was doing the analyzing, right? If you look at the international context, the West and commentators in the West were extraordinarily eager to find some kind of Muslim partner post 9/11. A partner in the war against Iraq, which Turkey refused to be, by the way. In 2003, the Turkish parliament said no to that. Trying to find, as you mentioned, and as we can talk about, kind of this model Muslim democracy, Islamic democracy combination. And very much it was the case that the AKP was trying to convey that image to the international system with its rhetoric, with its reforms that it undertook with the EU accession process. And sort of, the phrase that Erdogan used at the time was, "I've changed my shirt." And he meant by that even though I come from this tradition of anti-Western political Islam, and he had served as mayor of Istanbul as part of one of those parties, that he had taken on a very different approach to domestic politics. He didn't want to govern by Islam. He thought that was a moral principle, but not something that should, or I should say, he portrayed the idea that he thought that this was something that should guide moral principles, but shouldn't be part of governance. So when I say it depends on who's observing, the hardcore secularists in Turkey at the time, got a lot of criticism for saying this is a threat to our society and this party is going to take power and it's going to Islamicize society. And they were pushed back against by individuals saying we're sick of secularist military tutelage and we want to have a space for Islam in the public sphere. And I think that what happened was a lot of those who were the initial sort of those who were ringing the warning bells initially now kind of look back and say, look, I told you this was what was going to happen. I don't think it was necessarily the case that the way in which the AKP became as authoritarian as it did needed to happen. So I don't know if those secularists were right at the time. I tend to think that they were. I tend to take a cynical look, but I can't 100% evaluate that. But the last thing that I'll just say briefly on this is the other time that Turkey was looked at as a model for the Arab world, and again combining, economic model with Islam and democracy and so forth, was in the wake of the Arab Spring. By 2010, 2011, it was clear, if you were a Turkey observer, that constitutional changes had been made, that the movements on the Kurdish issue were superficial at that time, that already there had been purges of secularists through the Ergenekon trials. I can talk a lot about that. But by that time, Turkey was already clearly not a model for Islam and democracy. And then you have the Gezi Park protests in 2013, and as you mentioned, the crackdown in 2016. And now we are where we are today. So I would say, you want to be kind of circumspect in analyzing what Turkey was at particular points. But I think we shouldn't be really surprised where it is today.
All right, that's a great way to start us off. And I have to say, I neglected to mention, I see we already have a question. Please, as we go along, feel free to throw your questions into the Q&A box, and we will absolutely make time for your questions on the latter end of our discussion. But for now, I'd like to kind of pivot and kind of continue on this theme a little bit with you, Shadi, and you've. So I'll give folks a little inside baseball. How was I able to kind of get Shadi to join us this evening? All I had to do was mention Turkish Model, and his eyes, kind of lit up. So if you could tell us a little bit about this notion of the Turkish Model, how, it seems if you haven't studied it as extensively as you have, there are things that you can intuit about what it means, but perhaps you can help us be a bit more precise. What do academics and practitioners mean when they talk about the Turkish model as it once was? And was there kind of a gulf between how they viewed the Turkish model and how perhaps the masses viewed the Turkish model? And then finally, where does this notion of the Turkish model stand today?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Youssef. Good to be with all of you. So first of all, I think that people were right to look for and to hope for a Turkish model, because there really wasn't much to look at in the 2000s. I mean, there wasn't really a single democracy, with maybe the partial exception of Iraq. But obviously, Iraq was a context of war and then occupation. So there was always an asterisk there, even when it wasn't in full-on civil war. Lebanon, another asterisk because of its civil conflict, its sectarian nature, and so on. So I think that people were understandably looking for a place where, first of all, there was some semblance of democracy, but also, I think, quite importantly, some semblance of respect for democratic outcomes. And what was unusual about Turkey was that an Islamist party had come to power in the early 2000s, and it was able to stay in power. And now this had not happened elsewhere in the region. We had other cases where Islamists had come close to coming to power, such as Algeria in late 91, early 92, but then the Algerian military intervened and aborted the final round of elections. So that never happened. So, I mean, from my standpoint, as someone who focuses on Islamist parties, it's always been I think it was important, it still is important to have examples that people can point to and where they can say, hey, an Islamist party did come to power and the result was respected, and then we can let the process play out. There is, now we have basically, I guess, two cases of it now. Tunisia, and Nahda has been a junior partner, and it was previously the senior partner in coalition governments during and after the Arab Spring. And Iraq is still governed by a coalition that includes Islamist parties, Shia Islamist parties in particular. So it's understandable. So to go back to the original point, people were hoping, and there was good reason to think that Turkey was a positive model. I tend to disagree with the secularists who said early on that, and now they're saying, I told you so. At the time in the 2000s, Turkey was more democratic than at any point in previous decades, because in previous decades there had been coups, and there was a coup after an Islamist party came to power in the mid-90s, and that was the Welfare Party that Erdogan had previously been part of, and his mentor and sort of father figure Erbakan. Obviously, it hasn't worked out, and now people don't really talk about the Turkish model, and rightfully so, because it has gone in a much darker direction, and it is no longer a democracy in the normal sense of the word. And it's interesting to note that who else was talking about the Turkish model besides academics? It was also other Islamists in the region who were pointing to Turkey as a model and saying, we want to be more like Turkey. So I remember I would hear this quite often from Egyptian Islamists, Jordanian Brotherhood members, and Nahda members. The list goes on. Turkey was, in fact, the model for them. Now they no longer point to Turkey as a model. They might still like Erdogan. They might still say good things about the Turkish government, especially if they're living in Turkey, as many Egyptian Brotherhood members are in exile. They're based in Istanbul now. So they like Erdogan for giving them a home, if you will, but they're well aware that it doesn't really take you very far to tell people that you want to be like Turkey, because most of the international community, understandably, has soured on the Turkish model. So there has been a really profound shift, and I think it's worth being somewhat disappointed and sad about that, because it would have been helpful for the region to have more positive examples to look at. And the last thing I'll say on this is, I think there is a danger in calling Turkey today an authoritarian regime without adding additional qualifiers or caveats, because in my view, there is no moral equivalence between Turkey today and the other authoritarian states in the region. So it doesn't make sense to compare Erdogan to Sisi. Sisi is basically a neo-fascist, almost totalitarian leader. There's no dissent whatsoever. There are no opposition parties. There are no elections. There is absolutely almost nothing. There is no political life of basically any kind. Saudi Arabia, you can say something similar about it, the UAE, so on and so forth. Even Turkey is more democratic, or I should say, less authoritarian than countries like Morocco and Jordan that are soft authoritarian states, because there aren't really competitive elections in Jordan, in the sense that an Islamist party couldn't even theoretically come to power in Jordan. The same thing in Morocco, because the monarchy has absolute control over sovereign issues, over foundational questions, and can decide who to allow into government and who not to allow into government. So I think that's where I would maybe draw some distinctions, because I think there is a danger, and I think there's a lot of folks in the West, and especially in Washington, D.C., who basically say Erdogan is just like Sisi, they're all bad. And it's more complicated than that. And also, I would say that, well, at least a few years ago, I think that Turkey was still, not now per se, but even when things were getting bad, I think we could have talked about Turkey becoming an illiberal democracy. And we can maybe debate whether that phrase is an appropriate one. But I personally don't think there's anything inherently bad about a government that wins elections, several elections consecutively, saying, let us make different appointments in the bureaucracy, soft Islamization, which is what I would describe what the AK Party has done. It's not, I wouldn't want to live under a regime like that or a government like that. But if you win elections, you should and do have the right to embark on soft Islamization, or even less soft Islamization, if that is part of what your electorate has voted you in to do. And the whole point of being an Islamist is that you're an Islamist. So it's sort of like, it's odd from my standpoint to attack the AK Party for becoming increasingly Islamist when that's precisely what they're meant to be.
Except that's not what they call themselves.
Well, I mean, they were an Islamist party. I never they stopped calling themselves an Islamist party, but their origins were always clear.
Sure.
And I think that unfortunately they had to act like they were like they weren't, that they were something other than what they were, because of the fear of military intervention and the fear of there being a coup, which is generally why I'm against this idea that Islamists should suppress the very essence of who they are, because it leads to double discourse. It leads to pretending to be something you're not. It leads to a kind of, and it's just not healthy for individuals to suppress their deep ideological commitments.
So I'd love to kind of touch on that. We're definitely going to circle back on that point. But actually, I'd like to give you the floor, Lisel, and kind of build off a little bit about what Shadi talked about towards the end there. I mean, we do see some competitive elections, right? In Turkey still, right? We saw some mayoral elections that did not go the AKP's way. Do you think that perhaps we make too much of those little rays of pluralism, or is there something to be said for the fact that yes, things are bad, but certainly within the region, they could be a lot worse?
Sure. So I definitely appreciate Shadi's point about needing a qualifier for authoritarianism. And that's precisely why in political science, we distinguish between like sultanic authoritarian regimes, totalitarian authoritarian regimes, competitive authoritarian regimes, and so forth. Those distinctions are not even just about like which is more authoritarian or less, but like how that functions and what it looks like and how power is distributed. So I think that's a really important point to make. In terms of whether the elections are competitive and therefore the AKP has a mandate to rule, I think it's worth looking at the incredible dominance of the media that the AKP has. It's about 90 to 95% in the AKP's hands, not just through state-owned media, but also through the complex financial networks of the holding companies that own media outlets, but have construction interests and banking interests and political interests and so forth, that therefore don't allow the opposition any kind of airtime on their channels. So if we're talking about a playing field and free and fair elections, that's not what we're talking about in Turkey. We're also talking about a situation in which, to speak to your point about the mayoral elections, which is a really important one, because we have opposition mayors in Istanbul and in Ankara. As we know, in Istanbul, the AKP used its influence to have the Supreme Board of Elections strike down the initial victory of Ekrem İmamoğlu in Istanbul and force a rerun. And in that rerun, and this is actually really fascinating, in that rerun, some individuals who had voted for the AKP were so frustrated at the blatant attempt at stealing the election that they switched their votes to the Republican People's Party, the CHP, who eventually was able to take power. So yes, the CHP is in power, but let's look at the ways that the AKP has been able to financially hamstring the administration in the municipality of Istanbul so that they can't govern the way that they want to. So there are tools that are used to undermine the rule of those opposition party candidates that win. And I would be remiss if I did not mention the pro-Kurdish People's Democratic Party, because you have 73% of the mayors that were elected from that party having been removed. Some of them are in jail. And so what happens is the AKP allows those individuals to run. They won their elections, and then they are sort of brushed with the terrorist brush, and they are replaced by a pro-AKP mayor. So we're not looking at a situation in which opposition candidates are able to fairly win their elections and govern according to their own platform.
So on that last note, Lisel, I wanted to ask you if you can kind of elaborate on your particular expertise when it comes to Turkey, this issue of identity politics. It seems like a few of the things that you talked about there would be very much within that wheelhouse, and especially that note about members of the AKP, right? Supporters of the AKP switching their party. We don't see too much of that here in the US, these days, being frustrated with your own party. I mean, that's just beyond the pale. Obviously I'm sure you could regale us for hours, and we would love to have you come back and do so. But if you could tell us perhaps what is kind of the main takeaway you'd like us to have with regards to how identity politics functions in Turkey, and just because I know it's always such a sticky thing, if you could perhaps tell us what you mean by identity politics too. Sure. So we can all be kind of on the same page with you.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, people talk about identity divides in Turkey, in other countries where there are ethnic cleavages, or whether there are, say, pious secular divides. What I want to emphasize really strongly is that those kinds of divisions, those binaries, are way too simplistic. The Turkish military supported a Turkish Islamic synthesis, a reinsertion of Islam into the educational curriculum in the 80s to combat communism, because they thought that leftism was so scary. Let's use Islam as a way to bind the country together. So you can't just say military, no religion, military, yes religion. And certainly you can't now, because the Turkish military has been reconstituted from the inside out. So when we talk about identity politics, we want to talk about constructed understandings of differences, not inherent cleavages. Just because you're of one ethnicity doesn't mean that you're, inherently predisposed to hating another group. But what we are talking about is a system in which identity divides that have become constructed have become entrenched in the Turkish political system. And so it would be unthinkable for a lot of Republican People's Party voters whose party and whose understanding of national identity, as I understand it, is very much based in sort of a secularist understanding of both politics and society, in sort of a Western, Western-looking, modern sort of version of a republic, and that is different than the pious Sunni Muslim identity that the AKP promotes, what I call Ottoman Islamism. So for the Republican People's Party, I talk about Republican nationalism, kind of the legacy of Ataturk, the founder of the country. And then quite opposed to that is Ottoman Islamism, which has a different understanding of what a Turkish citizen looks like, as well as a different understanding of foreign policy. So often those identity divides, it's kind of hard to imagine people crossing them. Another one would have been the Kurdish issue, which is what I mentioned earlier. There was what I would say is sort of an identity red line for members of the main opposition party, the Republican People's Party, at least the old guard, against supporting anything having to do with Kurdish identity, and certainly a Kurdish political party, because for them, the understanding of a Turkish identity is either anti-ethnic or non-ethnic or Turkish ethnic, depending on. So the idea of, if you think about kind of Ataturk's experience of ethnic nationalism and like Balkan nationalism and Arab nationalism and all these different nationalisms that he saw as tearing the empire apart and therefore needing to be avoided, Kurdish identity itself became something that was dangerous from their perspective. And that's incredibly problematic when you kind of securitize an identity and you see an ethnic group as inherently dangerous to your own understanding of nationalism. That has actually eroded to the extent that in some elections, you have seen some Republican People's Party voters vote for the candidate from the pro-Kurdish party, mostly to spoil the AKP's share. the way that votes are distributed, it gets really complicated. There's a super
Sure.
high threshold for parliament. We don't have to get into that, but you have seen younger generations being more willing to touch taboo subjects like the Kurdish issue, like the Armenian genocide issue, and so forth. So you're seeing evolution of that. And in fact, to wrap up quickly, you saw a concerted effort on the CHP, that is the main opposition Republican People's Party's behalf, to reach out to Kurdish voters to help elect the mayor of Istanbul. And had they not been able to convincingly reach out to those Kurdish voters, they would not have been able to secure that victory. And so I think that, and that was made possible by a transformation in the way in which the candidate, Ekrem İmamoğlu, and the party in general softened its identity rhetoric and tried to back away from the polarizing language and sort of the hardcore Kemalist identity of the party previously.
All right, thank you so much. That was really enlightening. So, you know, certainly we appreciate anytime someone injects more nuance into discussions of what's going on in the Middle East, and certainly I think that we all want to see greater nuance, but it does seem like, man, that Islamist secularist cleavage is still doing a whole lot of work, at least, you know, cognitively speaking, at the mass level across the region more broadly. So, I mean, Shadi, if you could talk on about that, and you know, you've made the argument very eloquently in a number of forums, and you touched on it here about how, you know, in the Middle East, there can't be a kind of delimiting when it comes to issues of you know, who can contest for power, particularly when it comes to focusing on bracketing out any sort of Islamist tendencies. So how does the authoritarian turn of AKP, perhaps not fully authoritarian, we can kind of leave that off, but certainly a bit of backsliding. How does the backsliding of democratic governance in Turkey perhaps complicate matters a little bit? You touched on Tunisia and how basically, you know, a lot of secularists there now are saying, hey, look at what happened in Turkey. You know, they're casting the same aspersions on Al-Nahda. That well, they've been casting aspersions on Nahda, but now they feel far more vindicated in casting those aspersions. So if you can speak a little bit about, you know, kind of the current moment and how that kind of fits into this broader argument that you have.
Yeah, so just to situate this so people can understand where I'm coming from, I guess the first thing I'd say is, and this is part of the problem, well, number one, do we want democracy in the Middle East? My starting premise is that the answer is yes. If you don't think that that should be a goal in the Middle East, then we'll probably diverge in analysis at this first step. But the problem is, if you want democracy in the Middle East, or if you think that's preferable to the alternative, you cannot have democratization or democracy in the longer run in the Middle East unless Islamists are allowed to participate, and unless Islamists come to power, at least in many countries where Islamists are the largest opposition party. They'll either win the election, majority, plurality, or if they don't win, they'll have a good chance of being in a coalition government. And if they don't win one time, they may still have a chance of winning subsequently. And unfortunately, we might not like Islamists. We might think that they're terrible, ideologically dangerous, all that. But if we want democracy in the Middle East, unfortunately, to my knowledge, there is no other way to approach it than to say there is a chance that Islamists might come to power through elections. So we're kind of stuck on that. Now, you know, there's obviously a number of ways to prevent worst case scenarios. So if we're worried about Islamists coming to power and becoming authoritarian, we can think about how in the early period of a transition, constitutions can put limits on an elected government. So we don't go too much in the direction of majority tyranny, let's say, which is always a fear in a democracy, that You have a party that wins, they get aggressive, they're tempted by power, they move very aggressively to realize their ideological agenda. Ideally, you want to limit how far they can go, and it's up to each society to figure out where the red lines are. And that's one reason that, as like one basic principle that I advocate, is never go for presidential regimes when you're designing a constitution. If you have a president, you're probably going to have more polarization, and you're probably going to have a populist president at some point who wants to consolidate power and push more aggressively. And we've seen some of that in Turkey. That said, when people ask me, Shadi, is there any way to guarantee that Islamists won't go too far if they come into power? I'm afraid that I can't offer any such guarantee. There is a real risk that things will not go well. And I think Turkey is an example of that. Do I think what happened in Turkey was inevitable? No, I think there is contingency. Different individuals and parties have agency. If different things had turned out differently at different points, Turkey could have been different. There was an internal struggle, or there were internal divides in the AK party at crucial moments. Erdogan won those and was able to dominate the party. And others who disagreed with Erdogan, such as Abdullah Gül and some of the early founders of the AK party, they were sidelined. And they didn't play hardball as well internally, and they weren't as charismatic, and they weren't able to get their supporters to really stand by them the way that Erdogan was. Also, there was an attempted coup in Turkey. I wish there hadn't been, because that's actually, Turkey was already moving in an authoritarian direction, especially starting after the Gezi Park protests in 2013. But it got significantly worse with the attempted coup, and Erdogan sort of lost it a little bit. And I wish that there wasn't, and that there hadn't been the coup of 2016. Turkey still would have had its problems, but it probably wouldn't have been as bad as it currently is. But yes, there is always the risk that if an Islamist party comes to power, they'll go too far. But to be honest, there's always a risk if any party comes to power through free elections at any point. And I would actually argue that over the last several decades in the Middle East, the ones who have the worst record when it comes to democracy and moving in a more authoritarian direction are actually secularists and liberals to some extent. And we saw that, for example, in Egypt, where liberals basically supported, with the military coup of 2013, they supported ending democracy altogether. And they also supported the worst mass killing in recent Middle Eastern history, the Rabaa massacre of August 2013. So liberals have a pretty bad record. And I would argue liberals, maybe, and we could, not to get in this debate too much, but if I had to say who has the worst record on democracy, I would actually say liberals and secularists do in the Middle East.
So with that being the case, right? If you're gonna, let's assume arguendo, right? That you're correct. Yeah. Why is it that Islamists remain such a boogeyman in so many sectors in the Middle East?
I think the reason is that, well, if you're a liberal or a secularist in the Middle East, you have every right to be very frightened about Islamists coming to power, because if they get their way, they will alter the very very nature of national identity, the nation state. And these are very existential concerns. I mean, if you're a citizen, do you want your government to make you feel bad about not being more religious? Do you want your government to say that you're a bad Muslim? Do you want your government to populate the bureaucracy with people who are superficially Islamic? And that could be, more people who wear the headscarf, or more people who have beards or don't drink alcohol. And you can kind of be very intense on how you observe people's personal behavior, because if you know someone isn't properly Islamic, you'll say, no, we don't want to appoint him to this position. So I understand, and not to go into my history too much, but I'm born and raised here in the US, but my parents are Egyptian. My family is Egyptian. Almost the entirety of my family in Egypt are hardcore anti-brotherhood, pro-Sisi, and they don't really like they don't really agree with my positions on a lot of these things, as one might imagine. But I can understand, and we had these debates during the Arab Spring, why they said, Shadi, you're coming in and talking, you Americans, with your rhetoric around democracy. You don't have to live with the consequences of democracy. We're the ones who have to live with the consequences of the Muslim Brotherhood coming to power. And if they come to power, it'll change the way we live. And we're not willing to accept that. And you know what? I get where they're coming from. And there's just no way to resolve that argument. I'm a small d Democrat. I prioritize procedural democracy over substantive liberalism if they're in tension. And sometimes if there is democratization in certain countries, there will be a move towards illiberalism, and people's personal freedoms in certain ways might be negatively affected in the short term. You hope it doesn't last too long, and you hope that you can limit that. Again, that's why constitutions are important. And the US, if it has leverage, should try to prevent governments from going too much in that direction and Islamizing things too much. And that's why I think the US should play a role in democracy promotion. But unfortunately, there's no way to avoid this in the long run. If there is ever democracy in the Middle East in a broader sense, there will be aspects of illiberalism. And I try to be as frank as I can about the trade-offs, because I'm not going to come here and pretend that democracy is a panacea, that all democracies lead to liberalism. They don't. And we're learning here in our own country how they are in tension here in the US. We're seeing that in countries like Italy. We're seeing that in Hungary and Poland, in the Philippines, and Israel and India. This is not just a Middle Eastern problem. Liberalism, human beings, in my view, don't naturally incline towards classical liberalism. So wherever there is democratization, we're likely to see profound tensions when it comes to civil liberties, the role of religion, and the rise of populist parties, even in places where we thought democracy was well established, like in Europe, like in the US, and even to some extent in countries like Israel. And Israel is probably the most successful illiberal democracy in the world, for better or worse. Some people think that's good. Some people don't think that's good. But Israel is a really fascinating case, and there's a lot of cases we can look at.
Populism and identity politics, folks. It's a buyer's market. I'd like to shift gears a little bit, Lisel, and ask you, Shadi kind of touched on, the U.S. role in the region. And I was wondering if you can speak a little bit to, we have some models of how, an external agent can have, leverage when it comes to a country. But it seems that, I don't know, for better or worse, is at least from an outsider perspective, it seems that Erdogan has a lot of leverage when it comes to dealing with the United States and when it comes to dealing with Europe. With Europe, he has the migrant crisis, and with the United States, there seems to be a latent anti-Americanism. But then, you have President Donald Trump, going out of his way sometimes to laud Erdogan. So if you could help us kind of wrap our heads around what the kind of relationship is between Erdogan and these, large international blocs.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's an important dynamic. Before I do, I want to touch on something that Shadi brought up, because I think it's really important. Looking at the international context of this, and obviously the rise of populism and the authoritarianism that goes along with it, and the marginalization of other voices that go along with it. Because a lot of the authoritarianism that we see in Turkey has nothing to do with the AKP being an Islamist party. Its jailing of journalists is not because it's an Islamist party. You can link some of the identity politics, its gender policies, its view on LGBTQ individuals and so forth to Islam if you want. But there's also a very strong Turkish patriarchal culture that extends far beyond both pious Muslims and those who would support Islamist parties, because those don't overlap 100%. So I think it's really important to note that this trend is something that we're seeing in a lot of other countries as well, and certainly not just in the Middle East. And that leads to the fact that we have just such a populist would-be authoritarian leader in the United States that frankly enjoys surrounding himself with and finding himself in the company of what I would call hyper-masculine nationalist populist strongmen. And those are people like Erdogan and Viktor Orban and Duterte, Shadi mentioned the Philippines, and Vladimir Putin and so forth. And so there is this sort of affinity across them, as well as, frankly, financial ties that the Trump administration, let's call them financial incentives that the Trump administration has with Turkey, that lead Trump to be relatively tolerant when it comes to Erdogan, and in fact, sort of take his suggestions and act on them. And we saw that in a couple of cases. We saw that following two phone calls with Erdogan, Trump massively changes US policy in Syria, and says that they're going to withdraw forces and no longer provide support to the Kurdish Syrian YPG that the US had been supporting in the war against ISIS. You also see that Turkey, and just last week, tested a missile from its Russian-bought S-400 missile defense system, which NATO is extraordinarily opposed to, and in fact violates US law and therefore subjects it to CAATSA sanctions, Countering American Adversaries Through Sanctions Act. The problem with that is that that legislation is designed to leave the power to choose and implement the sanctions in the hands of the president. So as much as Congress is pushing for tougher action on Turkey because of Syria, because of the S-400 purchase, because of the extensive detention of Pastor Andrew Brunson and sort of the hostage diplomacy that Turkey engaged in to get to try to use him as leverage, because of Erdogan's security forces crackdown on peaceful protesters in the United States, and as it turns out, plainclothes US security officials as well. So there's all these issues that Congress has sort of had built up that it wants to push back on Turkey. And Trump is preventing that in a sense. To get to your question about, can the US, say we had a Biden administration or a different administration, can the US use any of its leverage to promote democracy in Turkey? I would say I don't think it can, and I think it should avoid trying to do so. And one of the reasons is that indigenous democracy promoters in Turkey get painted with an external brush, and then like they are working at the behest of external provocateurs, and therefore they become threats that the AKP can delegitimize and therefore jail. And so, Osman Kavala is a child rights activist, a democracy activist who's been in jail for almost 3 years now, I think, at this point. And he, of course, was accused of being kind of an agent of the US during the Gezi Park protests. So any attempt to reach out to the opposition, to support the opposition, is not necessarily, but is likely putting that opposition actor in danger, and is not necessarily doing them any favors. So it's a very, very tough, US democracy promotion efforts have been flawed in many ways, but I think in this case, you run the risk of delegitimizing an indigenous organic movement within Turkey, because you can then link it back to some sort of external provocateur.
All right. Well, we are. This is a really great discussion. We have a few things that we still want to kind of get to, but I'd like to bring in the audience if I can a little bit. I noticed that we have a few questions. Let's see if we can get a couple here. Here's one, actually kind of building off of the international component. So Ian asks, how should the world engage with Turkey today as it tests its borders? For example, with Greece and the Eastern Mediterranean, as well as with Syria against the Peshmerga fighters. Shadi, Lisel, either one of you, if you'd like to have any thoughts on that.
I can jump in quickly if
Yeah.
you want. So one of the things that we see under the AKP is that this different understanding of what it means to be Turkish prescribes a different foreign policy orientation. So one that is a much more activist foreign policy orientation, particularly with Muslim actors, particularly with Muslim Brotherhood actors in terms of supporting them, which pits
Yeah.
them, in a situation where they're lining up against, say, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Egypt, and on the side of Qatar and the Libyan GNA. So those are sort of the ideological partners, and Hamas, of course, that Turkey has, that the AKP has been supporting. You also see an increasingly activist policy currently in the Eastern Mediterranean, which is, I would argue, sort of a combination of the AKP's desire to project Turkey as this, formidable leader in the region, formidable in terms of like being one of the competitors for Sunni hegemony, certainly, but also formidable powers in the region. I think it also reflects a need for energy independence. So that's kind of outside of the identity politics arguments. But going back to the identity politics arguments, I think what you've seen in Turkey is kind of a rapprochement with the military. It's a reconstituted military. There were a lot of individuals who were purged after the coup attempt. The education system for military cadets has been completely transformed. So that's going to change the identity of the military itself. But because there was this uniting following the coup attempt against Gülenists who were seen to be this internal threat. So followers of Fethullah Gülen, an Islamic cleric in Pennsylvania, exiled, who supposedly was behind the coup attempt. Not only were the AKP's supporters horrified by that, but the great majority of Turkey was as well. And so it was sort of this, you have this external threat, and the military and even secularists could agree with the AKP that that's a really dangerous external enemy. So I think that kind of brought the AKP and the military a little bit closer. So we see a lot more military activism in Syria, in Libya, the military escorts to the drilling vessels in the Eastern Mediterranean. At this point, we're looking at Nagorno-Karabakh. So I think overall, we can see kind of some domestic shifting realignments that may undergird that foreign policy activism. But there's definitely a sense that Turkey has aligned itself with these Muslim Brotherhood actors, which then, because of other actors' opposition to them, kind of pits them in this regional competition, essentially.
Yeah. Shadi.
Yeah, I don't have a lot to add, and I'll defer to Lisel on Turkey's foreign policy, but just a broader point on some of the regional dynamics.
Yes, please.
I think that, and so part of the problem is, we've seen a kind of disengagement on the part of the U.S. and Trump has continued what the Obama administration started in many ways. I mean, is Trump engaged on Libya? Trump doesn't really care one way or the other. There really isn't an active diplomatic posture. Syria, couple airstrikes, which I personally supported. I wish that were continued subsequently and there was more of an active policy, but it was a one-shot deal. So it didn't actually change much on the ground in terms of the balance of power. But what all of this means is that, and especially, speaking as an American, thinking about what American policymakers, how they should approach these issues, we shouldn't outsource our Middle East policy to our allies. Because let's be honest, our allies kind of suck. Almost all of them suck. So this idea that we should give more responsibility to our Middle Eastern allies for them to police their own region and do more on their own, I'm not in favor of that. And the more that we as Americans step back, things do tend to get worse. This is not an argument for some kind of neo-colonial policy, but it is an argument to be more engaged in diplomatic terms, not military terms. I'm not talking here about replicating some of the blunders of the past, but there should be serious diplomatic engagement in places like Libya and Syria, but also when it comes to our allies acting recklessly in the region, there should be consequences. Now, as Lisel said, it's hard to do that with Turkey because we don't really have clear mechanisms of leverage. But with countries like Saudi Arabia or Egypt, we can pretty much ground the Saudi Air Force and the Saudi army if we really wanted to. And there's something I'm quite frankly in favor of, which is complete suspension of weapon sales, of maintenance, spare parts. If our allies want to play hardball, bring it on, and they should be punished accordingly where we have leverage, which is maybe not the most popular view right now, but I think we have to think about what we do about bad allies. And if people have ideas about how to try to restrain Turkey in their more problematic behavior, obviously you don't want to be too aggressive because Turkey is a much more powerful nation regionally than Saudi Arabia or Egypt. And Turkey is less dependent on us in economic and military terms. So we always have to have that in mind. But we do have to think, I think, quite systematically with a new administration about what do we do about bad behavior in the Middle East.
Relatedly, we have another question from Ian, actually, asking about what we do with regards to Turkey's membership in NATO. Should that be on the table? Actually, Lisa, this might be a nice way into perhaps talking a little bit about Turkey's failed attempt to, is it failed or relinquished attempt? I don't know how to pronounce, categorize it, to enter the EU, right? If you could say a little bit about kind of the evolution of the whole Turkey entering the EU phenomenon, and perhaps we can kind of dovetail into talking about NATO from there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I appreciate the NATO question. One of the things that we know from the international institutions literature is that you can have institutional conditionality and you can leverage it on a state until they enter your institution. And then your ability to use carrots and sticks is reduced. You can cut NATO funding. You can kind of marginalize countries by, not having them participate in particular military exercises. Those are all things that are discussed within NATO, marginalizing kind of Turkey in terms of the discussions that are being had. There's definitely a lack of trust, which I think is really important within an alliance, but that's a lack of trust on both sides. And I think it's really important to emphasize that. It's not just that the US is frustrated with Turkey as, carrying out incursions against the YPG that the US was supporting in the fight against ISIS, but also purchasing a missile defense system from Russia that undermines and compromises NATO technology, including the F-35 Jet Strike Fighter program. But you can also see it from Turkey's perspective, and the immense mistrust that comes along with believing, rightly or wrongly, but firmly believing that the US wanted Erdogan to go the night of the coup attempt. Frustration that the United States took a long time to support him. The first call he got was from Vladimir Putin. Belief that the US was involved in some way. The fact that the US has not extradited Fethullah Gulen from Pennsylvania. All of this leads to Turkish officials' beliefs that the US was involved in the coup attempt in some way, and then kind of retroactively that the US was involved in the Gezi Park protests, because that wasn't a real, salient narrative at the time, but they're kind of going back and rewriting their history and saying that's what we think was going on. They were calling it an interest rate lobby and a Jewish lobby and all the tropes that they use. So there's mistrust on both sides within NATO, but much more on the US-Turkey side as opposed to the Turkey-European states sides. Not all European states were completely opposed or as opposed to the S-400 purchase. The most important part in responding to that question is that there is no institutional mechanism for kicking a country out of NATO. You can't say, sorry, you are no longer in the club. That just doesn't exist. It's not to say that couldn't be created, but it doesn't exist. Turkey, I would posit, will never leave NATO. I see Turkey, and other scholars like Professor Oya Dursun Özkanca have written on this, as Turkey kind of testing boundaries, pushing boundaries, breaking boundaries, but never wanting to leave NATO, because as much as Turkey can kind of collaborate with Russia on particular issues, particularly in energy, as well as in Syria, because Russia controls a lot of the airspace, even though they line up differently in Syria in terms of who they're supporting. Turkey will remain fearful of Russia, particularly in the Black Sea. So Turkey needs NATO for sure. The EU question is a really important one. I use my first book, to discuss how the AKP used the EU accession process and the democratization criteria that go along with it to reduce domestic obstacles to its identity project. And so if you look at the great majority of the reforms, it was civil military reforms to weaken the role of the military and reconstitute it. It was judicial reforms to restack the judiciary in different ways, such that the Constitutional Court that closed all of the AKP's predecessors would no longer do so. And in fact, the AKP survives a closure vote in 2008. And such that the military that intervened, precisely as Shadi said, in 1997 to overthrow Erbakan's Welfare Party won't do so anymore. So I see that as a very strategic use of the EU accession process. Now, were there other members in the AKP who were sort of more pro-European, like Abdullah Gül? Yes, there were. But for me, this is probably an overquoted statement, but Erdogan is famous for saying that democracy is a tram car and you can get off whenever you want. And I sort of see the EU process as the same thing. Now, did the EU make critical mistakes? Absolutely. When you have people like Angela Merkel and Nicolas Sarkozy saying this is a Christian club, or maybe Turkey can have a special partnership or a privileged partnership, that doesn't encourage a state that already feels ostracized on identity terms, and one that recognizes that it's quite large and would pose a threat to other member countries in terms of voting power. And funding that it can receive and so forth, that doesn't bode well. And I think the EU's biggest mistake was letting Greek Cyprus into the European Union in 2004, because it lost, we talked about that institutional conditionality, it lost the ability to use that membership as a carrot to resolve the Cypriot situation, and find either a two-state solution or a one-state solution, or something that resolved that conflict that's an ongoing conflict. So I think the EU made major mistakes, but I also think the AKP didn't undertake the necessary reforms and didn't always necessarily do so in good faith.
Shadi, if you have anything you'd like to add to that, by all means, but I'd like to, I'm not sure this is a fully kind of formed question, but it has to do relatedly, if tangentially, with foreign policy, but more so in the sense of how the Ummah, right, how Muslims, right, regard Turkey.
Mm-hmm.
So you have some really bad actors, some sucky allies, as you put it, right, in the Middle East. But then you have Turkey kind of taking on this kind of neo-Ottoman mantle, right, of the one Muslim majority country that's able to kind of throw its weight around, and do so while still kind of framing itself as doing so, for the Ummah. Right. And how does that, is that a thing? Am I imagining it? I mean, so Lisel, I'd like you kind of go back to you after we hear from Shadi, because I'd like to hear you talk about how pop culture ties into this characterization. But Shadi, I mean, do you have this sense that, among American Muslims, there's this sense that, Erdogan, for all his faults, he's kind of bringing back pride, bringing back dignity, in a sense, to the Ummah. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so we see a number of examples where Turkey under Erdogan has engaged in a project of religious soft power and promoting a particular conception of Islam. I'm in DC now, and there's a mosque, I guess it's either in Maryland or Virginia. I always mix up.
Maryland.
Yeah, Maryland, the mosque in Maryland, which I've been to once, which is pretty impressive. But there's things like that, and you might ask yourself, well, why is Turkey? And they do these kinds of activities throughout the world, including in Muslim minority countries where Muslims are a small minority. They'll come and try to support local Muslim communities, Africa, parts of Asia. They're quite active in that regard, and there's been a real expansion of the embassies they have in various parts of Africa, so on and so forth. But it all fits into Erdogan's self-conception as a sort of neo-caliph. I think people can overstate that, but I think there is a part of him that sees the world in that way. And I think that Erdogan, he also likes the imagery and symbolism of this neo-caliph posturing, that you'll see these videos of Erdogan sitting down reciting Quran, and then people will sometimes send me these videos and say, look how amazing Erdogan is, and they're impressed by this kind of surface level performance. I mean, it is kind of impressive that he's good at reciting Quran and he's into various kinds of Islamic poetry. People are into that. It can be effective. And it fits into a self-conception. And this is why I think that Erdogan he's not an intellectual Islamist. I mean, he hasn't really tried to come up with a real Islamic alternative. And he was one of the few people who's been in power long enough to actually push through a more systematic reconceptualization of the nation state in a way that it might be in line with certain Islamic principles. But that's not something that I can really imagine Erdogan doing. And in that sense, I consider him more of a visceral Islamist. It's very emotional for him. And I believe the emotions are real. And you can see how he gets really into it, for example, like after the coup in Egypt in 2013, when the daughter of a Muslim Brotherhood leader, Mohammed al-Baltagi, was killed after the coup. Erdogan went on national television in Turkey and he started crying. And I don't think he was making that up. I think it's hard to fake that kind of emotion unless he's a psychopath. But I think that he really does feel a certain kind of cross-national solidarity, particularly with other Islamists and particularly with Brotherhood members and leaders in other parts of the Middle East. So I think that he's a Turkish nationalist in many ways, as Lisel has said, but he also has this transnational Brotherhood vibe. Now, he's the Brotherhood, obviously the AK Party and even the predecessors that were more explicitly Islamist were never part of the Brotherhood International. I mean, Turkey is too different for them to really fit into that. But I tend to see the Brotherhood less as an organization and more as a school of thought. There is no doubt in my mind that Erdogan is fully in the Brotherhood school of thought. That is his ideological orientation. And I don't believe that it's something that you can just get rid of overnight. I think it's like deep in his being. And I think we see signs of that emerging every now and then. And it also fits into how he views the legacy of the caliphate and also the legacy of Ottomanism.
That seems to jive with the sense that I get, and there are certain circles certainly here in the United States, not just in the mega mosque in Maryland, but across the U.S. That kind of hold Erdogan and Turkey in high regard, and part of it is this international phenomenon of these Turkish dramas. So Lisel, if you can tell us a little bit about how these Turkish dramas, are playing another role in kind of the spread of soft power.
For sure, yeah. I think one of the most important elements of this in talking about identity politics is recognizing that we often are kind of trying to parse the difference between like real identity, genuine identity that would make you cry, for example, if you identify with someone who had been killed, and the instrumentalization of identity, the mobilization of it for electoral support, say. And I think with Erdogan and with many identity projects, it's very much both. I 100% agree. This is in his DNA. This is in his blood. the family that he comes from, the household that he was raised in. You know, he comes from this rough and tumble neighborhood of Istanbul, comes from a very pious family. He went to an Imam Hatip school, so he was a preacher training school, essentially. He's a Hafiz, so he's memorized the Quran. He's known as a very effective orator when he's reciting the Quran. So that, and he was jailed for reciting what's considered to be an Islamist incitation, or a poem that is inciting Islam. So he also carries this kind of martyr identity with him, that he's able to, and this is where the instrumentalization comes in, he's able to sort of deploy when he's talking about, oh, you know, my daughters couldn't go to university in Turkey because they're headscarved, or I was jailed, and so forth. And that is a very powerfully resonating narrative for a whole lot of pious Turks who are frustrated with being told that they're backward because they're rural and they're pious, and, you know, they're of the Black Turk identity. There's this differentiation in Turkey called the White Turks, which are like the Kemalist, elitist, well-educated. It's not a racial thing; it's a socioeconomic thing.
Right.
And then he owns the Black Turk identity and says, you know, I am of those people that were oppressed. So I think that resonates not only within Turkey, but very much on the broader pan-Muslim sphere. If you look at polls, there's some great polls that have been done by the Baker Institute, by a number of different organizations, looking at, like, you know, what religious figure or who holds religious authority in your eyes, doing it across the Muslim world, and Erdogan is always at the top. You know, who's your favorite, you know, leader of a Middle Eastern country, and Erdogan is often at the top, or of a political party, say, and he's often at the top. So there's a lot of support for him. So I think part of it is his background, but as you suggested, and I appreciate you allowing me to talk a little bit about my second book, but these, you know, these soap operas, and particularly these historical dramas that are dramatizing the Ottoman era, and now with the most popular one that Erdogan adores and was given a private screening, Ertuğrul, Resurrection Ertuğrul, that's actually proto-Ottoman. So that's about the father of Osman, who was the founder of the Ottoman Empire. And so you kind of geniusly bring together what I call the Ottoman Islamists with this other group, the Pan-Turkic nationalists, who really take pride in the Central Asian Turkic tribes and the pre-Ottoman sort of use of Islam, and pre-Ottoman combat and so forth. So these shows are extremely popular among these particular demographics. They're widely ridiculed by people from opposite demographics. You know, I have so many, you know, Turkish acquaintances who would fall in, like, say, the secularist category if we were being kind of simplistic about things, and say, I'm so embarrassed when someone says, oh, you're Turkish, I love Resurrection Ertuğrul, right? Like, no. But I mean, look at, you know, viewership in Pakistan during Ramadan, right? I mean, it's huge. There's this within, for example, this particular show, Resurrection Ertuğrul. You know, the leader has a spiritual guide who's constantly kind of reminding him of the principles of Islam and how that can guide him in, you know, if he's faced with a dilemma, should I go into battle? How do I reconcile this, and so forth? So there's very much a sense that Islam is a guiding principle that one should rely on. And there's just this kind of, you know, that is in particular is pre-Ottoman, but there's this dynamic of what some call Ottomania, which is this real fascination with everything related to the imperial period. And that is bizarrely appealing. One wouldn't think that Arabs would necessarily really, you know, embrace this, or that Serbs would embrace this, or that these dramas would be popular in some of the, you know, countries where Ottoman oppression was experienced. And nevertheless, they are. It's also worth noting that kind of the genre that opened up Middle East markets to Turkish television, which, by the way, are popular because they're relatively cheap. They've gone up exponentially, but they're extraordinarily well produced. So the quality is very high. And they carry these kind of themes of, you know, the conservative family is always primary importance. So even series that aren't particularly focused on religion, that are just more family dramas, find resonance in some of these Middle Eastern audiences. And so that paved the way for viewers that would then be interested in these kinds of Ottoman era dramas. And as you look at interviews with individuals, if you look at tourism numbers in Istanbul, like there are Bosphorus cruises that are all about looking at the buildings where Noor was filmed, right? So it's an industry at this point. But that concept of soft power, I think, is really important. And here's another example of how that resonates. So even after this conflict that I mentioned, whereby Turkey is supporting Qatar during the Gulf crisis, where you have Egypt and Saudi and UAE lining up against Qatar, and Turkey is supporting Qatar. Well, Saudi cut Turkish television. Saudi Arabia cut access to Turkish television and immediately told its broadcasters to replace the content. We're not going to have any more Turkish television. Well, individuals got creative and they used VPNs and they found ways to watch these shows online. So it shows that they have some kind of resonance for them. And that in turn works as this kind of soft power mechanism, and particularly with these shows that are emphasizing Islam as some kind of moral guiding principle.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that. Yeah, and please keep an eye out for Dr. Hintz' new book. Do we have a date yet, or
no? It's in progress. In
progress. All right. Well, we'll put it on your radar for hopefully not too far into the future. So we're coming up on time here, and I definitely have a particular question that I want to end with. But I do want to get to I guess something of a two finger on a question that we asked earlier with regards to American involvement in perhaps promoting democracy in Turkey. So our one of our star Middle Eastern students, Rakan, he asked, is there any way that the U.S. can perhaps not directly, right, so that it doesn't undermine domestic efforts, but perhaps by proxy utilize some international institutions or some other leverage to promote democracy within Turkey. So I guess Lisel, that's kind of most directed at you, but Shadi, if you want to kind of broaden it out and touch on a couple of things, by all means. But Lisel, if you want to kind of touch on that subject real quick.
Sure. I mean, it's a question worth revisiting, and it's a real conundrum. I've been at a lot of talks, at think tanks in the U.S., at government institutions that are concerned about human rights issues. We have great advocacy here. Amnesty International is trying to lobby U.S. Congress to pay more attention to human rights issues in Turkey and so forth. But the question, of course, as I kind of tried to articulate earlier, is how do you do that without putting those who are those advocates for democracy in danger? And how do you do that without essentially affecting regime change? And, we talk about get out the vote initiatives, civil society activist training initiatives, sort of all the things that say the Open Society Institute would be involved in. Enemy number one in Turkey is probably Fethullah Gulen. Enemy number two is George Soros. So all of these initiatives come with the taint of meddling, come with the taint of external nefarious foreign powers. It's also been the case that with its allies, that the U.S. hasn't been super focused on, with some of the baddies that we talked about earlier, they haven't been so focused on the human rights performances of those countries. I think the frustrating thing for U.S. lawmakers is that in their minds, Turkey should be very different. In their minds, Turkey is a NATO ally. Turkey has been, in a formal alliance, but also has, participated in a lot of activities with the U.S. Its role in Afghanistan has been crucial. Its role in the Balkans was crucial. The Turkish military, in fact, Turkey applied to be a part of NATO in 1950 and it was denied, and it sent troops to Korea. Like, what business did Turkey have in Korea? Well, they were demonstrating that they could be a really valuable part of NATO, and the Turkish military was an extraordinarily effective fighting force. And so there's been this, reliance on Turkey for a long time. But I just don't see a viable way of the U.S. being able to directly, at least through government initiatives, advocate for any kind of democratic change. I think what we can do is call it out. I think we can point to the fact that Tahir Elchi's trial, who was an activist and lawyer in the Kurdish region, who was caught in gunfire, that his trial has been postponed over and over and over. I think we can call out Osman Kavala''s detention. I think we can call out the rising rates of femicide. I think we can call out the journalists in jail. I think we can continue to, we can have scholar rescue programs whereby scholars who have to leave Turkey are able to have a home and that their research can be promoted. So there's ways that we can do that aren't necessarily what we would consider democracy promotion. And I guess I would just say, to continue to raise those issues in the negotiations. When you look at US-Turkey relations right now, there are so many points of contention. There's the YPG I mentioned, there's the S-400 I mentioned, there's the Fethullah Gulen issue, there's a Halkbank trial, Iran sanctions busting, long story. Keep those issues of democracy on the table. I would say, I would encourage, because I don't think that the AKP necessarily thinks the US takes those issues too seriously. And with the Turkish legislators and think tankers and ministry officials that I've spoken with, they don't think the US takes those issues that seriously. So if we could advocate for those at the highest level, I think that's the best we can do right now.
Excellent.
And just to maybe just one or two things to add. I mean, we can't talk about promoting democracy in Turkey without thinking about how we promote democracy more broadly. Because let's say we started putting more pressure on Turkey, but we weren't doing something comparable with more authoritarian regimes like Saudi Arabia or Egypt, then it would just seem completely lopsided, and it would seem like we were targeting Turkey without having any kind of consistent policy. So I think what the first step is to come up with a more coherent approach in the region that we outline to audiences both at home and abroad. And then Turkey can be incorporated within that broader approach. But there can't just be a Turkey approach that is divorced from a broader policy or a broader reorientation. And then just a broader comment, in terms of how we think about supporting democracy abroad, sometimes people say, well, let's just be neutral as Americans and do no harm. Do no harm is not possible for the simple reason that there is no such thing as American neutrality. We already have pre-existing relationships with all of these regimes. Doing nothing would simply mean staying with the status quo, and the status quo is continued support of authoritarian regimes. And the obvious example here is the $1.3 billion of military aid to Egypt. If we did nothing and did no changes to our Egypt policy, that 1.3 billion would continue indefinitely. So that's not a neutral policy. That's a pro-authoritarian policy. And so there's really no way around this. And that's like one criticism I have of a lot of the sort of standard like leftist critiques of US democracy promotion is, let's just get out of the region. There is no such thing as getting out of the region. And no one, to my knowledge, has been able to articulate what that would actually look like, unless you're like a full-on isolationist, and that's not even a realistic possibility. So I think we have to just be, there is no innocent bystander option. We're always implicated, not just in what we do in the Middle East, but also what we don't do. Because what we don't do is itself a conscious policy choice.
So on that note, and with time coming up on the 7:30 end time, I'd like to stay with America a little bit. We have an election coming up in a little bit. I don't know if y'all, right? So make sure, right? Make sure you vote if you haven't already. I actually already voted. But reversing it a little bit, right? I think there's it's like the second image reverse or whatever it is, right? What can Americans, kind of learn from a lot of these global trends, a lot of the regional trends, and the trends in Turkey in particular, right? So kind of, dealer's choice, you can kind of take your pick, because there's this sense among Americans that we're this oh so special snowflake, that we're not susceptible to these social forces that seem to be undermining societies pretty much everywhere else. So what do you think are the most important kind of takeaways? Shadi, I guess I'll stick with you, and then we'll end with Lisel.
Okay, I mean, I'll say something maybe a little bit controversial here, and I apologize.
No.
So, I mean, Youssef, as you probably know, I'm still very much a believer in American exceptionalism. We are we are still, unless maybe there's one or two others if you stretch the definition, we're either the only or one of the only creedal nations in the world. In other words, that we are founded not on ethnicity or being a normal nation state or on an ideology like the French or on a sort of ethno ideology like Israel, depending on how you want to define that. So we are creedal, and not to go into what that creed entails necessarily, but and I have to say that even with Trump, and Trump is someone who I think has made a lot of Americans feel shame and disgust towards their country. And we have some very interesting polling that pride in America has gone down precipitously among Democrats and liberals, and I am both a Democrat and a liberal in the American context. But I have to say that as we enter this perhaps new era in 2 weeks or maybe 2 months or whatever, I look back at the last 4 years with a certain level of relief. I thought it would be much worse. And I'm just happy that we are a resilient country. The checks and balances worked. Trump was not able to realize his worst intentions, and that America has its flaws. But if we can survive the test of Donald Trump and still be a flawed but functioning democracy, and one that is able, God willing, I hope, to move into a new era soon enough, I think that says something very powerful about the American idea. And I think also anyone who wants to sort of talk very negatively about America and say, look how terrible democracy under Trump is. How can people say democracy is good when it produces Donald Trump? The whole point of democracy, in my view, is the right to make the wrong choice, the right to make stupid choices, the right to be self-destructive. And if we can do that and still live to fight another day and to practice democracy another day, I think we have shown something very impressive to the rest of the world.
Excellent. Lisel.
Sure. I mean, I guess I think, from police brutality to pandemic to economic collapse to the rise of white supremacy, if I don't know how it could look worse. So I appreciate your optimism. For me, it looks pretty effing bad. But I think respectfully disagree a little bit about the exceptionalist argument. I think when we think in exceptionalist terms, we tend to think that things can't happen here. Voter suppression can't happen here. The erosion of democratic institutions can't happen here. And I think the solid truth is that it has happened here, and it's happened to Black and brown people, and we haven't really reckoned with it yet. And so I understand the way that we're not necessarily technically an ethnic nation state, but white supremacy and the suppression of rights of Black and brown people has built a lot of our country. And so I think we need to reckon with that a little bit more. But also in terms of kind of what can we learn from the Turkish model, which is what I sort of refer to as the new Turkish model, which is how do you de-democratize a country very quickly? And that to me is what has happened under a Trump presidency. And that if we look at lessons from Turkey in terms of the channels by which that de-democratization happens, because democratization is not a linear trajectory. If you look at the delegitimization of the media or the co-optation of the media, if you look at stacking the judiciary, if you look at the use of the police and the security forces to oppress particular populations, if you look at the use of rhetoric to marginalize particular populations, there's a slew of channels through which the United States, I think, has, I mean, not necessarily to the extent of other countries, but has been subject to these de-democratization procedures that I think we would be remiss if we didn't recognize. And I never want to kind of, think of the United States as immune to any of those particular processes, because if we do, we become complacent. And the last thing we want to do on voting day and the last thing we want to do in this year is be complacent.
All right, that is an excellent note to end on. I always wonder whether, 5, 10 years from now, whoever is around in America at that time will look back and say, man, they made such a big deal about everything during this time. Or they're going to look back and say, man, how did they not see this coming? So join us in 5 years' time. We'll book it tonight, and then we'll figure out. We'll adjudicate between those two positions. But for today and for tonight, I hope you enjoyed this as much as I did. This was an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much, Shadi. Thank you so much, Lisel. I hope we can do this again. But please join me as we virtually thank our two panelists, and thank you in the audience for joining us this evening. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Youssef. Thanks for having us.
Thanks so much. Thanks, Shadi. Thanks, Youssef.
Bye-bye.
Excellent. Bye.